Okay, I think we are live. I will put down the PowerPoint.
Okay. All right, good morning, everybody.
Okay,
thanks for all of you joining us. Today is Monday, May 10th, and we are all here for the special meeting of the Ad Hoc Advisory Committee meeting for Rainbow and Fallbrook reorganization proposals. So I will call this meeting to order today at 10:04 a.m. and we will move to roll call. And if we could have the commission clerk proceed with that.
Good morning, Brian Albright,
Good morning, present.
Jack Beebe,
Here.
David Sherashore,
Here.
Rachel Cortez,
Here.
Gary Croucher. Gary Croucher, not present. Nick Canettis,
Here.
Tom Kennedy,
I'm here.
Sandy Curl,
Here.
Lydia Romero,
Here.
Kimberly Thorner,
Here.
there's a virtual quorum.
Thank you, Tammy. I appreciate that. We'll move on to the next item, which is item number 3, the agenda review by the moderator. I will just briefly let you guys know, I think you've all seen the agenda. It's pretty self-explanatory, but we'll basically have 3 reports. One and first by Dr. Hanneman, which he will give his draft preliminary analysis on the water reliability. We will then move forward with a report by myself to discuss the revised schedule moving forward, and then executive officer report by Keen Simons to give you an update on the current MSR for Fallbrook-Rainbow region. So I don't see any further changes that are necessary, and we will move on to item number 4, which is public comment. This is an opportunity for any member of the public to provide comments on a non-agenda topic germane to the advisory committee. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes. And if there's anybody out there, members of the public that would like to speak, or if anybody submitted comments, now would be the time. So is it Tammy, Ruth, who's going to be handling this for us today?
Tammy will handle the pre-registered speakers, and then yes, Ruth, and I saw Ruth on the line.
Yeah, I think I see her.
Ruth will let you know,
Email.
Adam, if there's emails on the live.
Okay,
Yes, I am here.
perfect.
So
Tammy, do we have any current comments that have been submitted?
None at this time.
And Ruth, do we have any emails that you've received for any public comment?
None received.
Okay. None received, then we will move on to the next item, which is item number 5, which is the business items. And the first level of action would be item 5A, which is the approval of the action minutes for the February 1st, 2021 advisory committee. You have before you a draft minutes that have been prepared by the administrative assistants for the February 1st, 2021 special meeting. Those draft minutes are in action format and are recommended for approval. So if there's a motion out there in a second, we can proceed.
So moved. Second.
Okay, we have a motion by Kimberly Thorner and a second by Sandy. Can we get a roll? No?
It was Lydia who seconded.
I'm sorry, Lydia
Yes.
was the second.
Yes.
I apologize. And Tammy, if we could do a roll call. Vote.
Sure. Kimberly Thorner,
Aye.
Lydia Romero,
Aye.
Sandy Curl, Sandy,
Aye.
Tom Kennedy,
Aye.
Nick Canettis.
Aye.
Is Gary Croucher present? No.
I don't think so.
Rachel Cortez,
Aye.
David Sherashore,
Aye.
Jack Beebe,
Aye.
Brian Albright,
Aye.
We have 9 in favor, 0 opposed. The motion passed.
Thank you, Tammy. We will now move on to item 5B, which is the consultant report from Dr. Michael Hanneman. So as I indicated earlier, this is his draft preliminary analysis on the water reliability. And I think this is what everybody kind of has been waiting for. So without further ado, we will pass the baton over to you, Doctor, and let you take it.
Thank you. Do you want to show the title page? Is that how we're doing it?
Sure.
Yes. So we're doing, we're sharing this. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I have 4 items for you. Yeah. Yeah. I think if you do view at the top left, yeah, okay, that's perfect. So I have 4 items for you, 3 spreadsheets, one dealing with San Diego County Water Authority, one dealing with Eastern, one dealing with Metropolitan Water District. And then I have a technical memorandum, which accompanies those 3 spreadsheets and describes the assumptions I'm making and the data sources and so on. And then I prepared this presentation as a 5th item, but the items of record are the 3 spreadsheets and the technical memorandum. And what I'm doing in this presentation is just summarizing those. So the detail is in those items. Yeah. Yeah, if you click view, it should give you the option of full screen or something like that.
Yeah, I was
Yeah,
looking
full screen
for
mode.
There it is.
Yeah. Yes. Yep. Thank you. And so this is just the set of topics in this talk. Next slide, please. I've spent basically since March looking at data, looking at documents you sent me, looking at the urban water management plans, looking at Metropolitan's IRP process, and pulling information together. This is the preliminary analysis. This shows you the numbers I'm using and the assumptions I'm making. The assumptions can be changed in response to your suggestions. So this is sort of put together, but subject to change based on suggestions, based on new information, or whatever. So you should consider it a draft. The issue is the relative reliability between the Water Authority and Eastern, but both agencies depend on Metropolitan for supplemental water. And so I'm also analyzing Metropolitan in relation to those 2 agencies. And as I mentioned, I'm using the urban water management plans that I've received for the authority and for Met, and the IRP data. And I'm going to talk about the IRP in the next few slides. If you go on to the next slide. it's important to understand the difference between urban water management plans and an IRP analysis. By construction, the urban water management plans have no shortage. That is, there's no year or sequence of years in which the projected demand exceeds the projected supply. There are dry years, critical dry years, and runs of dry years. But in the plans I've seen, and this is the normal practice, demand and supply balance. And in this case, since the agencies are members of MET, the balance sort of comes about from saying we'll get supplemental water from MET. In MET's urban water management plan, demand and supply balances also. So there's no shortage. But MET, going back to 25 years, MET supplemented the urban water management plan, the 1995 one, with an integrated resource plan, an IRP. So the point is the IRP has uncertainty, stochastic uncertainty, and I'll talk in a moment about the uncertainty in the present IRP. Whereas the urban water management plans don't have explicit uncertainty. IRPs go back to the 1980s and were first developed in the energy industry by energy utilities. And on the energy side, on the electricity side, I think the major uncertainty was the demand side, because they plan supply capacity, years ahead of time. There's an elaborate process for approval. And so IRP came about in the electricity industry to deal with supply uncertainty, with demand uncertainty. MET was one of the first major water agencies to use IRP in 1996, and there's demand uncertainty, but there's also, as we all know, unfortunately, major supply uncertainty. So an IRP explicitly models the risks, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Let's go on to the next slide. So as I said, MET started doing this in 1996, so 25 years ago. And then it did that in 2004, 2010, 2015. And it planned one for the 2020 Urban Water Management Plan. What it found, so it also published last year a retrospective assessment of the 2015 IRP. And what it found was that some of the things projected in 2015 didn't happen. There were surprises. Demand turned out about 16% lower across, on average, across member agencies. Local supply turned out 16% lower. And the state water project now is seen as significantly less reliable than it was in 2015. And the MET staff developed a sort of probabilistic assessment of the state water project deliveries for this 2020 IRP, which is much more pessimistic than the one they'd used in 2015. But in addition, they wanted to add an extra element, which for 2020, which is called a scenario modeling approach. If you go to the next slide, I'll just spend a few minutes summarizing. This is from a memo distributed actually at the beginning of May. The important thing is this kind of in the first bullet, this is an approach where they consider a number of alternative futures rather than kind of a single projection, which, for example, is the practice more or less in the urban water management plan. Next slide, please. And the lesson is, so the first thing to emphasize is that a scenario is not a prediction. It's a possible outcome, a possible future outcome. And the logic of having scenarios is kind of what if. And the scenarios are intended to cover a range of possibilities, and therefore they present a wider range of potential outcomes than if there was no scenario or a single scenario. And the emphasis, as mentioned in the third bullet, is there are a number of factors that are very uncertain and very uncontrollable. And climate change and regulatory intervention, both with regard to importing water from the Delta and importing water from the Colorado River in the event of, in the contingency of a drought, those are they're sort of extra elements of uncertainty that Met staff felt it important to build into the 2020 IRP. Next slide. So the IRP has a separate analysis for each of the 26 member agencies. And then those numbers are pulled together for all of Met's member agencies as a whole. So they don't break down individual agencies served by Eastern or San Diego or anybody else. So the analysis is at the member agency level. And it's broken down. Obviously, there's an analysis of demand, agency demand. There's an analysis of agency local supply. And the difference between those two is the member agency net demand on Met. And then under the Met tab, there's an analysis of Met sources of supply, the State Water Project and the Colorado River Aqueduct. And all of that is posted online. There's then another analysis of Met's managing the storage, the water it has in reserves and water marketing purchases to fill any gap between net demand from member agencies and supply from the Colorado River Aqueduct and the State Water Project. That third analysis of drawing down reserves and water marketing isn't posted online. So going back to the member agencies, there's an analysis of demand and there's an analysis of local supply. And those things are broken down into subcomponents. So there's demand is based on population, household size, housing units, jobs broken down by major economic category and stuff like that. And that information comes from the Southern California Association of Governments. And then on the supply side, as you'll see in a few minutes, supply is broken, local agency supply is broken down into various subcategories. So there's a lot of detail on the demand side. There's a lot of detail on the supply side. The major hydrologic variation is the supply side, not the demand side. So the demand side varies by year, but that's it. The supply side varies by year, but within each year, there's a hydrologic variation, and I'll describe that in a moment. Next slide, please. just to give you this was originally initiated in January of last year with the plan to complete this in the last calendar year. So this is a presentation made in February of last year, February 2020, of what they expected. And you see the IRP kind of was moving alongside the urban water management plan, with the IRP to be completed by the end of last year. And this, of course, got upended by COVID. One thing I should draw your attention to, in addition to the IRP and the urban water management plan, Met staff and board of directors plan a rate study which would follow on after the IRP and urban water management plan are completed. And I think that is still the intention of Met's board, but that's for the future. As far as I know, that's not been started yet. Next slide, please. So this is a slide presented at the end of January, showing the timetable to complete the IRP. And I've since checked with Met staff, and maybe there's be some slippage, but they expect this to be completed by the end of this calendar year. The major data that was developed last December and posted in January. And so far, at least as of last week, there'd been no further updates. So I'm using the data developed through December, presented to member agencies in December, posted in January. Next slide. So the scenarios are based on two factors. One is the reliability of water supply. That's the upper bar. The word stability is a bit of a euphemism. The real issue is no regulatory constraints or no more regulatory constraints on state water project imports and Colorado River imports on the left side, and more regulatory constraints, whether because of the Delta or because of drought on the Colorado River on the right side. So less stability means more uncertainty and the likelihood of obtaining less water from the state water project or the Colorado River. And then the other dimension is sort of economic growth in the region, generating more or less demand on metropolitan. Next slide, please. So if you combine those two factors, Met staff came up with 4 scenarios. 2 scenarios with low demand, A and C, 2 with high demand, B and D. 2 scenarios with stable imports, meaning sort of not more uncertainty than up to now, A and B, and C and D scenarios with more uncertainty of imports. Next slide, please. And what's driving, so it's not just regulatory uncertainty for the Delta and the drought contingency plan with the Colorado, it's also climate change. So the Met staff have made a very serious attempt to include projections of possible climate change impacts on stream flow in California and also on the Colorado River. I worked with the California Energy Commission from 2003 onwards as co-directing California's climate change scenario project. And so I've been familiar with this type of assessment of climate change impacts on California's water supply for 17 years now, and I'm impressed with the sort of quality of analysis that has gone into Met's IRP. Next slide, please. So as I said, all of these data Met has had roughly monthly presentation to member agencies going back to January 2020, and has had presentations to the board meetings. And all of that material, all of the presentations are posted on a web page, and I downloaded all of that data, reviewed all the presentations. There were a number of documents. There was a special a retreat for the Met board to discuss these issues. There was the assessment of the 2015 IRP. All of the documents that were posted, I've downloaded and reviewed. And as I say, the key thing is the data used in the IRP so far, and I've downloaded it and I've used all of these data files in my analysis. Next slide, please. So as I said, the point of an IRP process is to bring uncertainty into the analysis and check whether what's the likelihood of a gap between demand and supply. The IRP covers the same time span as the urban water management plan. So the IRP looks at actual data, actual demand data over the last 10 years, from 2010 to 2019, because this was being done in calendar 2020. And then it projects 26 years, starting in 2020 and running through 2045. So the analysis, there's an analysis for every year. On the hydrologic side, for the various hydrological variables, there's actually, for a given year, 96 numbers, because they're drawing on a 96-year hydrology running out from 1922 to whatever, 2017 or 2018. The bottom line of the IRP analysis so far, and this is still subject to revision by the Met staff, is in the two scenarios, there's no gap between demand and supply. But in two scenarios, B and D, there is a gap. In the B scenario, and you can see from the red color, the gap, there's no gap in the first 5 years, but there's a gap of about 6% in 2030 and 2035, and then it gets a bit larger as time progresses. That's scenario B. In scenario D, there's a small gap in 2025. In 2030 and 2035, the gap is 13 to 26%, and it's larger even later. This tells you, the red and the blue tell you the probability of a gap, not the amount of the gap. Next slide, please. But this is a slide that Met staff presented, which give indication for some of the years of the magnitude of the gap. The way, as I'll explain, the way I will do my analysis, there is actually no gap at the level of metropolitan. And I'll explain, but I'm bringing in the other uncertainties that are covered. So next slide. So this just says I'm replicating the IRP analysis, but focusing on the Water Authority and on Eastern. This assessment is not my prediction of what is most likely to happen, and not Met staff's prediction of what is most likely to happen. This is looking at what what could happen that would stress the system. But that's the logic of a reliability analysis. You sort of want to know, if nature throws a curveball at us, how well are we situated to handle it? And so the stress will come in scenarios B and D. And so I'm going to focus on the IRP data for those two scenarios. Next slide, please. And so I have the IRP data, I have urban water management plan data. Here's what I've decided to do, and I can change this. I decided to look at the 6 years, 2030, 2031, 2032, 2033, 2034, 2035. So 2030 and 2035 kind of bookmark the span of what could happen. And in terms of shortage, where there's a shortage, it's less in 2030 and most in 2035. So I'm going to present to you the numbers for those years, but I'm looking at them as a range of possibilities. I'm not predicting what exactly will happen in 2030 versus 2031. And in general, although I'm going to be presenting numbers, this is not meant to be 6-digit precision. I want to sort of convey the ballpark of the uncertainties that the authority and Eastern will face. So I'm interested in the sort of range of uncertainty rather than the specific number for 2030. So as I mentioned, particularly for stream flow related supply variables, there's a simulation. So for some supply variables, there's not a simulation for each. So for example, recycling is projected by Met staff to sort of build up over time, but it has a given number for a given calendar year. But for stream flow, local stream flow, also I think, I'm saying this from memory, groundwater, local stream flow, local groundwater, state level stream flow, Colorado River stream flow, there is uncertainty. So a given calendar year, like State Water Project deliveries to Met in 2030 is represented by 96 numbers, each number being a possible outcome under a given year in the hydrological record, modified for climate change, so that the future going ahead will be a little different with climate change than what we experienced. And so when you put all the numbers together and you look at the net demand on Met, for a given calendar year, there are 96 numbers that are intended to be a probability distribution. And I've represented that in several ways. I've looked at the median year, the number corresponding to the median. And the median is the year such that 50% of the years are lower and 50% are higher. So it's not the mean, and the mean and the median are different because this is technically a skewed distribution. The median is there's a 50-50 chance that this will be the outcome. Now, if we look on the low side, for example, if we look at risks of we're looking at water supply, the median is not sufficiently pessimistic. And so I look at two outcomes, one on this slide, one I'll add to this slide. I look at the lower percentile, the lower 5 percentile. That is, only 5% of the years have a lower number, 95% of the years are higher. So that's a very low supply number. I will also look at the lower 25 percentile. 25% of the years are lower, but 75% are higher. And at the other end, I'll look at the 95 percentile, which means only 5% of the years are higher. 95% of the years are lower. And those I have all those percentiles. I have computed them from the IRP data. So those are things that can be modified. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the important thing, the second, third, and fourth bullets. As we'll see, some of the demand projections, particularly the high end of the distribution, are high, both for the authority and for Eastern and for Met. However, and this is a judgment call that could be done differently. What I'm thinking is that it's likely that if we run into a significant drought, there will be something like the conservation mandate. And the result is the sort of very high demand outcomes won't materialize. And so I'm going to, for the guts of my analysis, I'm going to look at the median demand projection, the median under scenario B, the median under scenario D, but not go higher, because I think, and not only that, but we're past conservation legislation since the last drought. So that's my way of handling that. Then I make two assumptions on the supply side. One is that the authority will, in all circumstances, in all years, receive 278,700 acre-foot of Colorado River water, because that will come under Imperial's water right, which is high in seniority. I assume that Metropolitan will, in all circumstances, receive its water right of 550,000 acre-foot of Colorado River water. That's the first assumption. And I'm also going to assume that whatever shortfall it has with reference to its 550,000 acre-foot of Colorado River water and its state water project allocation, it will make up that shortfall every year from stored reserves or from water market purchases that it set up. It has 5.3 million acre-foot of storage capacity. As of, I think last year, it had 3+ million acre-foot in storage. It doesn't provide the data for modeling how it manages its storage, but I'm going to assume that Matt will avoid the shortages, even those that are referred to for scenario B and scenario D. Next slide, please. So I'm going to present the numbers from my spreadsheets and summarize some of the technical memorandum, but I'd like you to look at the spreadsheets and the technical memorandum, because those are the documents of record. I have three separate spreadsheets, one for the authority, one for Eastern, and one for Metropolitan. Next slide. So this is just the items. So the spreadsheets are somewhat long, so I've taken chunks of the spreadsheet and cut and paste them in this presentation. So this is just some of the tables I'll be showing. Next slide, please. So I'm starting with the authority, then I'll go on to Eastern, then I'll go on to Metropolitan. And in the case of the authority, I'm starting with supply and then going on to demand. And I'm starting with the urban water management plan and then going on to MET's IRP analysis. And then I'll do demand, the urban water management plan, and then the IRP analysis. So the thing to, so first of all, some of the numbers in the IRP analysis are different from those in the urban water management plan. And that can happen because this is the authority's urban water management plan and MET is doing its IRP. And so some of those numbers will be different. There's also organizational differences. So the way the IRP breaks down some supply categories is different from the way the authority breaks down supply categories in the urban water management plan. But in my spreadsheet, I've tried to match categories so that when you see the spreadsheet, there is essentially the same categories for supply for the urban water management plan and the IRP. There's one other difference. The IRP treats the authority's Colorado River water, the 278,700 acre foot, as not being local supply, but as coming under MET's supply. And so I've corrected that by pulling out the 278,700 acre feet for the authority and putting it under local supply. So, the bottom line here is, so the urban water management plan has 3 scenarios: a normal year, a single dry year, and a run of 5 dry years. The supply is about 500,000 acre foot in the bottom line in a normal year, and about 481,000 acre foot, either in a single dry year or multiple dry years. Next slide, please. So the next slide shows the IRP analysis. And so as I say, the IRP supply has 96 possible outcomes for each year. And I've summarized the bottom 2 rows. A median year, 50% of the time supply will be lower, 50% higher, and a low supply year where 95% of the time the supply will be higher. And we have scenario B and scenario D. And if you go on to the next slide is going to compare the urban water management plan in the top row with the IRP analysis. I will do part of the comparison in this slide and the next part of the comparison in another slide. But the sort of scenario B median year of the IRP sort of lines up with the normal year estimate from the urban water management plan, 530,000 acre foot in one case, 532, whatever is 560 in another. Next slide. And then the urban water management plan dry year of about 481,000 sort of lines up with the critical 5 percentile year under scenario D. I'll come back to the next slide, please. So let me just talk about the demand side. So what we have here is both the urban water management plan projection of demand and the IRP. So let me just go through them in turn. The urban water management plan projects a baseline baseline conservation with, baseline demand with existing conservation, and then projects additional conservation going forward. And the urban water management plan projects in a normal year demand of 583,000 in 2030 and 603,000 in 2035. And then it revisits demand in those 2 years under dry year scenarios, and that's the next 2 rows. The bottom is the IRP projections, the under scenario B and D. For a median year, 50% of the time will be lower, 50% higher, and a very high year. And just to remind you, I'm going to ignore the 95 percentile estimate because I've said, I think conservation mandates will make that not happen. So the next slide just sort of comments on the differences. The IRP numbers are higher. They look more like without conservation, the urban water management plan is 650, 670, and that's kind of more like the scenario B median year, and the scenario D is median is a bit low. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the IRP numbers, I'm going to do a sensitivity analysis, and I'm going to use the urban water management plan. And I'll show you the results both ways. Next slide. So putting things together, I'm going to look at 2 demand scenarios, the row labeled A and the row labeled B. The row labeled A is from the urban water management plan. The row labeled B is from the IRP analysis. And then I'm going to look at 2 supply scenarios, both from the IRP, a median year supply and a critically low supply, a 5 percentile supply. That's row C and D. So in E and F, I use the IRP demand from row B and the supplies from rows C and D. And in rows G and H, I use the urban water management plan from row A and those same 2 supplies. And what I have here is the net demand on MET, that is the gap between the authority's demand and the authority's, quote, local supply, including Colorado River. And the next slide puts those same numbers in percentage terms. So what I've added here is what percent of the demand faced by the authority in a given scenario will need to be met up, will need to be met with additional supplies, supplemental supplies from Metropolitan. Using IRP demand in scenario B, it will need about 24% of its demand from MET. In scenario D, it will need about 30% of its demand, and using the urban water management plan demands, it's about 25%. So the numbers are not identical, but what I take from this is the authority's need for supplemental water from MET is going to be in the range of 24 or 25% to 30%, depending upon the particular outcome. Now I'm going to go on to Eastern, if you give me the next slide. So this is the IRP analysis for Eastern. It has variation, year-to-year variation in demand under the 2 scenarios. I have the median demand, the median year demand, 50% will be higher, 50% lower. I have the 95 percentile, the high demand outcome, but I'm going to ignore it for the reason I've mentioned. If there's a drought, there'll be a conservation mandate. I don't think the high demand will materialize. The IRP analysis of local supply has no hydrologic variation. So it's just that row. And to calculate Eastern's net demand on metropolitan, I'm subtracting its supply from its median year demand. And that gives me the bottom two rows, depending upon whether it's 2030 or 2035, whether it's scenario B or scenario D. This is ballpark 50 to 55% of Eastern's demand that it will need to make up from Met. Now we come to the third and last spreadsheet. If you go to the next slide. So the first bunch of rows I'm doing because I need to correct for the fact that Met treats the 278,000 acre foot from the Colorado River as not local supply. So I put it back to local supply. So the middle row, Southern San Diego County Water Authority net demand on Met, is when I've put the Colorado River back in the authority's local supply. And so I'm using the median year demand for the authority from the IRP analysis, and I'm using the median year local supply from the IRP analysis for the authority. So it's the median demand number and the median supply number. And then, so that's this middle row. And then I add that to Met's calculation of the total demand for Met. And so you see the total demand for Met under scenario B is, about 1.7, just under 1.7, and it's between 1.8 and 1.9 million acre feet under scenario D. And if you take the authorities, whatever, 160, 190,000 acre foot demand on Met, that's about 10% of the total demand of all member agencies on Met. And if you take Eastern's demand, which is also about 170, 180,000 from the previous spreadsheet, that's also about 10,000. So both agencies will have a need for supplemental water from Met that's about 10% each of Met's supply. Next slide. So that's the demand on Met. Now I look at Met's supply. And I assume that Met is always able to get its water right of 550,000 acre foot. That's actually not what the IRP analysis assumes. It assumes more likely that only about half the time Met will be able to get 550,000 acre feet. But Met has water in storage and it has other arrangements that will withdraw on that I don't know. So to first keep things simple, I assume Met gets its 550,000 acre feet. However, this is the IRP analysis, the second and third rows of what Met could get from the state water project. In the median year, in scenario B, it's the same number for scenario B and scenario D. it's the same median, but the low outcome is lower for scenario D than scenario B. What I've done here is I haven't looked at the 5%, which is really low. I've looked at the lowest quartile. So 25% of the time, the IRP projects Matt will get less than these numbers, but 75% of these time it'll get more. So it can count of these numbers for 75% of the time. So I've added, I come up with two estimates of Matt's kind of core supply from the State Water Project and the Colorado River Aqueduct. Now, in scenario B, the median year supply covers the demand. The demand was shown on the previous slide, but it's all on the same spreadsheet. That's under scenario B. But when you have the low outcome, the lower 25 percentile, even in scenario B, there's some gap. I'm going to assume, though, this gap is made up from Matt's stored reserves and water market purchases and whatever. So Matt's gap in the 25 percentile supply scenario is about 20% of the water that it would need to meet all its agency demands. That's scenario B. In scenario D, under the median supply, it's short about 25% of its water. In scenario D, it's short up to about 40% of its water. I'm assuming it makes up these gaps. So now if you just come to the last slide, which summarizes some of what comes out of these numbers. So the authority's net demand for water, depending upon the scenario and the year, is about 24 to 30% of its total need for water. And to repeat, these are sort of worst case, or at least not good cases, because these are the stress scenarios, B and D, for all of the agencies. Eastern's net demand for water amounts to about 50 to 55% of its total need. Met itself will be stressed to some degree in the sense that its core supplies of State Water Project water and Colorado Aqueduct, it will also need to go beyond them to get between 25 and 40% of its water, depending upon the scenario. The last two bullets are my conclusions so far. So the actual amounts of water that Eastern and the authority would need in this kind of stress situation, about, in round terms, 170,000 acre foot or so, the very similar in quantities. They each about 10%. However, I do think that the authority has a somewhat higher likelihood of always being able to fill its entire need for supplemental water. Given its history with Met. So that's the end of my presentation. As I say, this is written up more in the technical memorandum, and all the numbers are in the spreadsheets, the three spreadsheets.
Thank you, Dr. Hanman. I know you've taken a deep dive into a lot of information and presented a lot of data, and this information is, or this item is informational only, but I do want to open it up for a brief period of general discussion to the committee and or any questions or comments that they have. So if there's anybody that would like to weigh in or ask Dr. Hanman any questions or have any comments, now would be the time. Tom, I see you raising your hand first, so why don't you take a crack at it?
Thanks. I was looking for the raise hand button. And thank you, Dr. Hanman. I appreciate the work you've put into this. Two main points. First, and I think it's important for everyone to consider what LAFCO's policies and what the decision points are related to supply reliability when they're considering any change of organization. And it's not necessarily to look at the absolute difference between two different sources, is whether the source has an adequate supply. I think that's the way it's worded in the policy L107 or L109, I think it is. And I think that it's important to note that it appears to me from the outcome of your analysis that that certainly is the case. On your last slide, you had a bullet point where you made an assessment that I can't remember exactly what it said, that you felt that they had a higher likelihood of meeting some last component of supply, even though that supply would come from the exact same source between Eastern and the Water Authority. As in this scenario, which that scenario D is an outlier in a big way. I think that most of us who are looking at future water supplies aren't considering that as a really likely, highly likely outcome. But how did you make a determination that since both San Diego County Water Authority and Eastern will both get that last cohort of supply from Met, that somehow San Diego County Water Authority is better positioned to do that?
So with respect to your first point, let me say, I'm not going to offer a judgment of the adequacy of anybody's supply. And precisely because that's a judgment for the commission. And I see my role as presenting data, along the lines of this data or other data, if that's suggested. But it's really for the commission to make a policy judgment of what's adequate. So I agree with you, but I wanted to say I'm not going to offer a judgment, because I think it's really, let me put it this way, regardless of whether I offered a judgment, the commission would make its own judgment. So it's just a waste of breath. With regard to the last bullet, I make 2 points in my memorandum. On the one hand, the authority has stated that its preferential right amounts to 25-point-something% in Met. And on the other hand, the general manager in a letter to Keene in February or whatever stated, I have the exact language in my memo, but stated, well, let me read the, so what he stated is, Met has a water supply allocation plan adopted by the board in 2008 and implemented in 2009 and in 2015. The goal of the plan is to even out the hardships of water shortages throughout the entire service area, so that some member agencies are not severely more impacted than others. So there are two conflicting statements. The authority is Met's largest customer. Eastern is Met's 6th largest customer. And then there's another 20 customers that are smaller. What I say in the memo is I'm not going to form a judgment as to what the board will decide to do. But it seems to me that the Eastern is more exposed to the need for supplemental water than the authority. That's what I mean by the sentence. But it's for the commission to decide what this, what's the bar to have an adequate supply. And as I said, that's not my judgment.
So I guess to take that, the preferential rights is the factor that you are using to make that determination?
No, I think there are two things. So I understand there's been, litigation and the preferential right is, but I'm saying it's the difference between depending for 50% of your supply on supplemental water versus 30%. I think that.
Jack, you want to go?
Sure. And just to follow up, I think if this is going to end up just in front of the commission to say, does Eastern have an adequate supply? I mean, ultimately, supply reliability is a decision of our local boards that make that decision in terms of what's their level of reliability they want. So I guess if it's going to go to LAFCO's board, I think it would be helpful to present what would it mean to Fallbrook and Rainbow under this, scenario D, which I guess is a 40% rebound in demands. But I think also showing A and B becomes important, because laying out the range of outcomes, and that's where a governing board has to decide, how much do I make a decision based on only the worst case outcomes and plan around that. So I think at least highlighting what happens under, what's most of us are projecting, or sort of the A and B scenarios, would be helpful. And then for us as local agencies like Fallbrook, where we're going to be looking about half of our demands from imported water, this means a little bit less to us if half of those demands then have a reduced allocation. And we're saying, all right, if those conditions occur, you'll have to do additional conservation, like you noted in your report. And in the past, that's resulted in some, 30+% reduction in demand. Putting that all together in terms of what does that mean for a rural water agency, I think would be a helpful context.
I understand what you're saying, but let me say, I made the point, a reliability assessment is a stress test. It's what happens in not a worst case, but a bad case. And the hydrologic uncertainties are very severe. A 25 percentile low supply, I think, is optimistic. I don't think, a 25% of not having enough water is an issue. Now, there's on the other side, there's how much water Met has in storage and whatever, and that data, that part of Met's analysis wasn't posted. Met showed in scenario D, there was a significant risk. But let me just, so first let me back up and say, I with regard to sort of adequacy, if there's without guidance, I'm not in a position to judge sort of what the word adequate means. And with regard to reliability, as I say, I view this as a matter of a stress test. I can certainly put in the numbers for scenarios A and B and do the spreadsheets. Let me say, so I'm open to changing, modifying details of the analysis, and I'll take guidance about that. I wanted to put together a complete analysis for everybody to see it. And I understand you'll have time to make comments and suggestions and follow up, and then I'll make revisions, in the light of this. So I sort of await guidance.
Yeah, and the only reason I raise that is even the Water Authority has written letters to Met that says scenario D demands are unrealistic, right? And so if we're just planning around a demand profile that largely most of us, we're not going to see a 40% rebound in demands in Fallbrook. And yeah, maybe the rest of California will, but I think it's unlikely. I think that just using that as our baseline, presents a picture that doesn't really give the full picture. That's all I'm saying. And I understand why you use those, but without, all the scenarios, it sort of presents potentially a different picture than is an alternative.
Yeah, and so I used the urban water management. I did a sense, and I can use other demands. I sort of, for this initial presentation, I wanted to work off sort of numbers that were sort of there, and I assume that the Met staff will do some revisions to the IRP. I mean, I have no idea what ones, and I was kind of hoping they might, put out a timetable or done this. But so I was sort of going by what was available, through last week. But I understand your point.
Sandy, I think I see your hand up next. Why don't you go ahead?
Thanks, Adam and Dr. Hammond. Thank you for your report today. We're going to need to take a really close look at the information as a deep dive, and I'm sure we caught a portion of what you said and processed, and so need to go through the written document. I have a question and a comment, and my question is, wanted to know if in the look at the water, if there was an analysis or part of an analysis done under a scenario where there was an earthquake, what that would do in terms of the reliability. I would also like to say that we'd be happy to provide more information on likely sources of and costs of supplemental water, because I think that's a portion of where the analysis hangs its hat. And I think it's important to look at that and really the viability of that in a extreme drought situation, whether those sources of supplies are going to be available. And I think this is really points to a little bit of the differing situation between the two applicants and the reliability at the retail level, given that one has supplies and one does not. So I guess my real question is, did you take a look at an earthquake scenario?
So just to answer that question, the answer is no. That's my understanding. That is, it wasn't part of the IRP analysis, as far as I know. Let me just say, with regard to your second point about the costs of a supplemental supply, that's sort of the topic that's up next.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, I wanted to say the way, the reliability, I think was question 2 or question 3. It wasn't the
Mm-hmm.
first question. But the reason I decided to go in this sequence was for the analysis I'm reporting on. That was a chance to become familiar with the numbers, the different supply sources, and so on. So it was useful for me to, as I say, really get into the quantities involved on the demand side and the supply side. And then the next step, which I get onto now, is looking at rate impacts, which is going to look at the costs of existing supplies and other supplies. So the rate impacts is the next item. And my thought is, I've gathered information. I spent a whole bunch of time in January and February and part of March sort of looking at, reading all the documents and looking around, and then honed in basically in April and since the beginning of April and now on the reliability. But my plan is to sort of start looking at the rate impacts while waiting to receive comments and suggestions on the reliability analysis. So as far as I'm concerned, if everybody agrees, that's up next.
Really appreciate that. It's a great start. It's very complicated, and appreciate the work so far. So thank you.
Put your hand up.
This is Nick. May I jump in?
Thanks. I don't know if that's your audio or getting a little interference, but I think, Nick, you have your hand up.
Yeah. I appreciate all your efforts. I put a lot of effort.
Nick, let me stop you for a sec. Nick, I think we're all getting a lot of feedback and interference on your microphone.
Really? Don't think I'm doing any different than usual, so.
Maybe
Yeah.
call in on the phone line.
Okay.
Sounds like a Darth Vader with COVID. David, do you want to go while Nick figures out his audio?
Thank you, Adam. Dr. Hanneman, thank you very much for your presentation. That was a lot to digest in 1 hour's time. And I'm sure it was a lot for you to put together also. It's much appreciated. And I look forward to spending some more time with it and connecting the dots across the spreadsheets and looking forward to hearing what our next steps are as well. Thank you.
Jack, I think, do you have your hand up again? You want?
Yeah, just quickly, why I guess Nick's figuring out his audio. If we're going to do rate impacts, especially, I think looking at the whole range of scenarios becomes important. So to just, again, plan on sort of the outlier scenario, because one of the decisions really for not just LAFCO, but our boards, obviously, right, is what do you plan around and which situations make sense. So I think having the full range of outcomes and what are the projections in each of those outcomes so that a board can decide, you know, all right, here's the range of alternatives, what seems like the most realistic ones, what seem like the most realistic, you know, long-term rate impacts is an important thing to lay out.
No, and I said, it seems to me that reliability is a stress test. I don't view rate impacts as a stress test in the same way. So
okay, sounds good.
Nick, is that you on the phone?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, that is much better. You have the floor.
Okay, I apologize for that. I don't know what's happening on my end here, but I'm glad I was able to connect. So again, I was saying I really appreciate all the effort that's gone into getting us to this point here. There's a lot of information there, a lot to digest. The first question is, will we at this point get copies of your written draft report so that we can get our heads around this analysis a little bit better?
That was my intention. They'd be distributed, the spreadsheets and the technical memorandum.
Okay,
Nick,
perfect.
The answer to that is yes, it will be distributed. We'll get it all out to every committee member. And just to kind of add on to that, you know, as everybody has indicated, there is a lot of information that has been presented in a short amount of time. So it will take some time for you guys to digest a lot of what's in there. I think at some point too, Dr. Hanneman would like to offer that if there are any committee members or member agencies after they have digested this, if there's any additional questions or comments or concerns, I think we can set up an opportunity to set up some individual Zoom calls with Dr. Hanneman so that you guys can have a level of dialogue with him as you go through this information even further.
That's great. That's perfect. Because I too, like Tom Kennedy was saying earlier, I'm trying to get my head around some of the summary conclusions that are being reached at this point, given that the analysis is showing that both the County Water Authority and Eastern have, you know, similar need for supplemental water, as to why the determination is that Eastern is more vulnerable at this point based on the scenarios that you're looking for. You mentioned the Metropolitan Water Supply Analysis plan as well as preferential rights. So I assume there'd be a better detailed explanation, understanding of what that is, because I'm struggling to understand that at this point.
And if I can just follow up what Adam said, obviously, you may want to submit written comments or criticisms, and that's entirely appropriate. But what I was thinking is there may be some questions where it's simpler to talk than to you write a letter and I write back. And so, you know, depending upon what's useful, I thought doing some of this orally, you know, how did row 20 relate to row 18? We could do orally, but that's not meant to head off, you know, written comments and suggestions.
Nick, do you have anything further, or is it?
Not at this point.
Okay.
Thank you.
Are there any other committee members that, Tom, go ahead.
Thanks. Real quick, maybe this question is for Keen. Given that Dr. Hanneman's report is unlikely to produce any specific conclusion related to reliability, but just lay out some information for the commission, how do you foresee staff presenting, condensing, or summarizing what I assume is a fairly lengthy analysis for the commissioners to consider?
Thank you, Tom. I would assume and anticipate staff will pick the conclusion and assumptions that are most reasonable to us being LAFCO staff, and go forward with that as our recommendation to the commission.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Anybody else? Yeah, Brian?
Thanks, Adam. Thank you, Dr. Hanneman. And I think, Keen, your comments sort of enforced a question I had in my mind for you, Doctor. I think I've seen in similar analyses like these on other topics, sometimes the assignment of a relative probability of the various scenarios. And I didn't see that. And I believe from just listening to your comments that that's not part of this. Did you consider that or will that come at any time?
So I'm not aware that Met staff has sort of presented data that would illuminate that probability. So, so all I know about this is what Met staff have posted on that webpage. I've downloaded every item and read it, but I only know what they've put there. I know there have been meetings between the member agencies and Met staff. I don't know what was sort of said either by the member agencies to the staff or by the staff to the member agencies at that meeting. So I would need sort of more information in order to go the step you're mentioning. And if, those of you, Eastern and the authority as member agencies, if you have access to more information, that would help. Also, if you know whether Met will update that and what its timetable, and then we could figure out sort of whether I could make use. So at this point, I haven't seen, and if there are sort of published commentaries on Met's analysis, as I say, all I've seen is what Met staff has posted. So I don't really have anything else to go by, including, the SCAG, whether SCAG has made comments. In other words, I understand the issues. I understand the issues about rebound. I have spent a lot of time studying urban water demand, and so I sort of understand the issues. But I'd like to have some sort of basis for going beyond the material, if that's possible. And as I say, maybe some of you as member agencies have more information.
Sandy, I think I see your hand up again.
Yes, I just had a question on sort of the timing, getting the materials, and then kind of what we're looking at of a comment period, an opportunity to talk with Dr. Hanneman further. Do you have an idea of what that time frame is, or do you need to see what level of feedback is received?
Adam, I think you have an...
Yeah, I can answer that for you, Dr. Hanneman. So without skipping too much ahead, I think you'll see that in the next item with our revised schedule on what type of periods we're looking at for each topic that Dr. Hanneman will be analyzing, and then what type of comment periods will be in between those topics. So if you could just hold off really briefly, I think we'll get to that, and then we can discuss at that point. Any other committee members that would like to weigh in or have any questions or comments? I don't see any other additional hands, so I will also check with Tammy and Ruth one last time to see if there are any members of the public that have submitted any communication prior to this hearing and or during it.
None received at this time.
Also, no emails received at this time.
Perfect. Thank you, Tammy and Ruth. Keen, did you want to add in to something?
Yes, thanks so much. I was thinking about the great answer I responded to Tom, and then I was thinking, well, maybe it was incomplete, because Brian's then subsequent question where I generated a question for him made me realize it was incomplete. Staff will certainly take the professor's conclusions and assumptions and ultimately offer up what we think is the one that most appropriate lines with our thinking. However, before we get to that point, LAFCO's staff and the commission is going to ask this committee, okay, what do you think of the assumptions and conclusions that are tied to these assumptions? Which do you believe are most appropriate? So I want to make sure that the committee understands its direct role in helping to inform that ultimate decision making.
Thank you, Keen. Okay, I don't see any other hands and no members of the public, so we will now move on to the next item of business, which is the revised schedule, which Sandy hinted to. So if I could ask Stu to bring it up, that would be helpful. So you'll see, I'll cut to the chase. And so I think this spurred from a question from one of the committee members at our last meeting in February on what was going to be the time frame of the work being performed by this ad hoc committee. And as you can see in the schedule, the goal is to wrap up the intent and purpose of this committee by the end of the year. And so what I've done is I revised the schedule based on a previously one that has been sent, because I think after what Dr. Hanneman has presented is that his analysis is going to be more in a linear fashion than what has been previously provided. Because if you go back to the previous schedule, we were bouncing back and forth between topics 1 and 3 and topics 2, and we were having 2 parallel tracks of public hearings that were kind of running parallel to each other. What I wanted to do is make this a little more linear as Dr. Hanneman conducts his analysis, so that he has started with what's been presented today in the draft analysis of water reliability. So you'll see today, May 10th, we've had that meeting, which then goes on to the next timeline and milestone of what Sandy had questioned, is that we are going to set up 2-week comment periods for each draft analysis. And so for this first one on reliability, the 2-week period will be May 24th. And as I also noted, that period of time between these 2 dates, I do want to, Dr. Hanneman and I do want to provide opportunities for any committee members or member agencies to develop any type of one-on-one sessions or questions that we can set up some future Zoom calls that we can kind of have that dialogue back and forth, rather than trying to limit the exhaustive back and forth communication with the written communication. And so I think it might speed up the schedule, might speed up Dr. Hanneman's analysis, that if we can just set up those types of interactions. And so just going through it real quickly, there's multiple ad hoc committee meetings set up through the year, the remainder of the year. These are all tentative. It's all based on Dr. Hanneman's analysis As I said, it's going to be linear, and if Dr. Hanneman wants to add on to this, he certainly can, but he's looking at the water reliability at this point in time, which will then kick into his analysis of the rate impacts to the water, and then that will then kick into the last topic of what any analysis would conclude for any potential exit fee. And so those are all set up with individual committee meetings, 2-week comment periods, and then after the conclusion of all that, I think Dr. Hanneman will provide a final comprehensive report with any assumptions and conclusions that come about. And I think we've labeled that as the September 20th meeting. And after that final comprehensive report, we'll open up a 45-day public review period. And then, like I said, the end goal is to have this being all wrapped up by mid-December. And as Keen mentioned, hopefully having the ad hoc committee provide its own recommendation to the LAFCO commission so we can pass that baton on to Keen and his staff and eventually to the full commission of LAFCO. So I'll open up the floor on this item if anybody has any questions or concerns, or if there's time to digest it at a future point, everybody knows how to get a hold of me and we can discuss. So I just want to preface and say that, you know, these dates are tentative, things are subject to change, but I think there is advantage of seeing something a little more linear in trying to get this completed by the end of the year. Rachel?
Yeah, will we ever get materials before the meetings, or will we always be in this situation? And then could I also request that we have some spillover time in the meetings, because I don't want to get something scheduled after this meeting if we end up going long again for the other meetings?
With regard to the first item, your first question, I'm not sure, just because this was a detailed report. The spreadsheets were completed sort of by Thursday, but writing up the technical memorandum then led me to make changes. And so this is not a lot of time, for example, to get into the rate impact. And so it may well be, it's more likely the same situation. I realize how frustrating this is, but it's this combination of doing an analysis, creating spreadsheets, but also writing you know, in words something that can stand scrutiny, I'm afraid.
And to your second point, Rachel, yeah, we can certainly set up some sort of buffer for the meeting times so that there's no conflictions with or conflicting schedules of other people's time. So we can certainly make that available. Is there any other further comments or questions to the revised schedule at this point in time? Okay, having seen none, we will move on to the next business item, which is letter D, and it's the executive officer report. And so Keen is going to give us an update on the MSR for the Fallbrook-Rainbow region.
Thank you, Adam. So a couple of things. One in particular jumps out, and that is Robert Berry, our chief policy analyst, retired within the last few weeks. And so as a result, Robert was the lead on the MSR. I am going to pick up the slack, work on that myself, along with hopefully some others on staff. We are right now in kind of tying down a lot of the technical data. Tom and Jack's office and senior staff are helping us on that process. The end result is committee. We had hoped to bring to you and the commission, for that matter, a draft MSR in June. That, as Adam's timeline provided, has been adjusted to August. I don't believe there will be much of a slip after that because not only is staff picking up on this, but I'm in talks with a recently retired EO to come in and help make sure that it does not slip past August. So we are in relatively good shape there. The one variable that I want to follow up on is the Riverside LAFCO. Many of you know this LAFCO has an MOU with Riverside LAFCO to coordinate our analysis and our thinking. Gary Thompson, their EO, and I have had some conversations, as has Adam. I think we will want to bring in Gary's thoughts on the process in sync with getting yours. So again, I don't think there should be any more slip, but it is a bit of a variable because I'm not sure if Gary will want to take this to his commission. That's not part of the MOU. It's just coordinating with Riverside, but that should help round out the discussion. And the reason why Riverside is getting involved in the MSR component, it's not so much of Rainbow or Fallbrook, but it's just to make sure on Nick's side that the Eastern component is appropriately contemplated. So that's the update with respect to the MSR. And of course, the reorganization proposals themselves are somewhat on the tarmac in awaiting kind of the completion of the MSR and then your work here at the committee before they go any further. But all the procedural stuff that Robert covered in the last few meetings has been taken care of. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Keen. Just real quick, is there any questions or comments for Keen on his brief report? Okay, having seen none, I think that wraps up our business items for the day. I will check one last time with Ruth or Tammy to make sure there have been no other written communications, both prior or current of the meeting by the public.
None at this time. I have not received any.
No emails received at this time either.
Perfect, thank you. Thank you so much. And so that will set us to the last item, and it's the agenda setting for next meeting. I just want to check in with anybody. Is there anybody that would like to add some level of item or discussion to the next agenda? I don't anticipate anything at this point in time, but if there is, please reach out to me and we can certainly get that on the next agenda. And with that, I think that adjourns the meeting, and I will call this meeting adjourned Monday, May 10th at 11:40 a.m. And I appreciate everybody's time and participation and look forward to the next one.
Thanks, Adam. See you, everybody.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you all.